first, I thought I'd start with the hardware. Since most people have not really seen glass or played with glass too much, this is something that I didn't really know about, so it's something that I wish I'd known more about. So in the main part, the focal part of Google Glass is this top right screen where you're looking into. That's where you get all your information from. Now, it's kind of not what I expected. It's really small. It's on the top right, so you really have to stare into it. It's not like you can focus on something in front of you and the screen at the same time. It's not at all augmented reality. There's no real way right now, at least, to see what the camera is seeing through that little screen. And even if there was, it's kind of too small in this iteration, at least, to be that useful for augmented reality, at least as far as I've seen. And you'll also note that you can kind of tell when someone's using Google Glass because there's like a white light right there. So it's not that discreet yet. I'm not sure if that factors into any applications, but it's just something to be aware of. So there's a couple ways to interact with Google Glass as a user. The first is this kind of touchpad on the right side, which lets you swipe left and right and also up and down actions, though those aren't that used in the current OS yet. This fits in very well to the way that the OS is kind of presents the navigation right now, where everything is just kind of a screen and you're just flipping left and right to go past screens, and you go up and down to go down and up levels of hierarchy. The next button is just a dedicated button right above the camera, and that just lets you take a picture. I'm sure that you can use it for other things, but right now it's only exposed for pictures. Along with that, there's various other sensors that can be useful. There's accelerometer, gyro, as Oswald was saying. Actually, the way to turn on Google Glass is to move your head up, so it can actually sense that and turn on or turn off Google Glass accordingly. It can also respond to voice, and there's also this interesting sensor kind of in the inside which looks at your eye and tracks it. Google hasn't really officially said what they're using it for. There was one open source project which kind of hacked it and used that sensor to check if you're winking, and it would take a picture if you're winking. So that was kind of interesting. It's not clear if Google's going to officially let users or let developers access that, but it's something to be kind of wary of as Google moves forward with kind of getting this ready for consumers. So the next step is apps. Apps are kind of interesting because they're a lot different than iOS and Android. So I'm just going to use the example of New York Times for a lot of these. So for the New York Times app on iOS or Android, I'd go to the App Store, download the app, and right there I'd see all these articles. I'd go click one, read it, and I'd kind of be done. Maybe I'd open that once every couple days or once every couple hours, depending how interested I was. On Google Glass, though, there's no concept of native installation. There's no Google Glass App Store where you go to get your apps. I think this in a lot of ways is because the screen is just so small, it's really hard to navigate. So instead, you kind of OAuth through, so it's just a simple kind of sign in with Google Glass on any website. They kind of take your credentials, and the app is just kind of added. But there's no concept of, you're not pulling information from that app once you have it. It's all notification based. So it's all the developer chooses to send a notification to your Glass after you've signed in. So because Google doesn't offer their own kind of listing of all of the apps on Google Glass, there's a bunch of third-party sites that kind of list all of the major ones and allow you, kind of link you to the OAuth screen right there. So let's kind of walk through how the New York Times lets you get their app. So the first step is you go to newyorktimes.com/glass on any device, be it your computer, the Android phone, an iPhone that's not linked to your Glass, anything. And all you have to do is connect my Glass. And that's a standard OAuth to Google prompt where it asks for Google Glass timeline and glass.location permissions. Let's say you accept that, and you're done. Kind of now the New York Times app is on your Google Glass. Whenever they choose to send notifications, you'll receive them until you revoke access. New York Times kind of makes it simple. It's just success and you're done. But most apps, I imagine, will kind of from here, you're signed in with your Google credentials. This is a unique ID for that user. And there you can manage settings. New York Times, maybe you choose, I care about this category, not this category. And kind of all of these settings are generally would be determined and decided on a website that the user can access from anywhere rather than the Glass device itself. So I mentioned cards. So the base element in the Google Glass UI is a card. So as soon as you turn on your device by moving your head up, you see this card in the middle, which is just gives you the time and OK Glass. So the way you interact with this is it's a pure voice card. So you say, OK Glass, search for X, or call Y person. And from here, you can do all of the voice commands you want that kind of integrate mostly with search and other Google products like Google Hangouts. As soon as you're on the screen, however, you can swipe right. And on the right side, you'll see a list of all of the notifications from the apps you've subscribed to. And these will just be the newest to the oldest. It's kind of an infinite list. It'll just go on to the last one. I think Google limits this to 7 days worth of notifications, but it's not very clear. And so the newest one's at front. So generally, when you turn on Glass, you'd kind of check for the newest couple notifications until you got where you stopped last time. And that's it. You're kind of updated on what's happening. However, an interesting part is that from the OK Glass card, if you swipe the other way, you get a list of pinned cards. So these are cards that the user explicitly has decided are important to them, and they want always to be there so that they don't get swallowed up by a list of new notifications that might come in front. So an example pinned card might be something like the weather, which just kind of updates automatically when stuff changes. So the user always wants easy access to that to see, the weather. So that's something that they might pin. And so pinnable cards is a feature Google allows in their API that allows users to pin your card. And from there, you generally use it to make updates or use it to do things like, I want to send a new tweet. So go to this card and send a new tweet. So notification cards come in a lot of shapes and sizes. I mean, they're all in the same 640 by 360 box, but they look very different. So this is Twitter, which is just exactly as you'd expect. This is kind of what it looks like on the website. This is what it looks like in its mobile app. And now this is what it looks like on Google Glass. The New York Times, though, kind of chose a different approach. So they have this pretty card with the picture on the top. You click on that, and you get a list of stories. And you just can navigate through all the stories by swiping left or right. The stories are on the second row. And from any of the stories, you can click on them to read them out loud. And what New York Times has done they put a longer snippet, so they can maybe show the title and maybe a couple sentences in the card itself because it's so small. But they say, here's longer text that would be read aloud if the user is so interested. So now moving on to the API. So the base object in the Mirror API then is the timeline. It's a timeline card which has some display content. Developers can choose if that's just text, which Google auto resizes to fit in the card, or they can just have arbitrary HTML. Arbitrary is in quotes because Google has a very strict list of tags that are allowed and not allowed. There's no JavaScript allowed, and they have a limited, very small size. But you still have a lot of CSS3 options kind of just within the confines of the Glass Mirror API proper. But in addition to just kind of supplying this HTML string, which is just rendered on the mirror on your glassware, you get a lot of interesting interaction options. So one is display time. So every card has a date, like a created at type date, but you can actually specify when a card should be displayed. So let's say that you have an alert happening or some to-do item happening in 10 minutes. You can say the display time is now plus 10 minutes. And that card would always be in the front of your notifications until 10 minutes passed. And after that, it would kind of start filtering back based on other notifications that pop up in front of it. You can also specify speakable text. So that's text that you want to be read out loud with the card, since a lot of times, and most content-heavy apps will see this, you can't really fit most of the content you want on the little screen. So you'll want to have some way of extending that content, be it letting the user email to themselves or just being able to read it out loud. There's also the option of bundling cards, which is kind of interesting. So a lot of times you might feel confined, very confined with just a small card, but you can actually have a card that links to a list of other cards, which you can then swipe through. So you kind of saw that in New York Times where they have a picture card, and clicking on that picture card gives another list of stories from New York Times. So these are called bundles, and they're one nested list of cards. So one of the more interesting parts that kind of separates Google Glass from, let's say, an Apple push notification, Android push notification, is that you can interact with it. So Google has something called menu items, which are just, you can specify 0 or more menu items, which is just a way to interact with it. So Google has some built in, like a reply, which will actually let you talk to that card, and it will transcribe the text and send it back to the server. You can delete a card, read it out loud, pin it if you want. But you can also create your own custom actions on cards. So Twitter might have a tweet action. New York Times has, could potentially have like an email to me action if I'm interested in that story. So all you need for these is kind of a UID that your server could recognize, plus a name and an image. Google's also kind of started testing out states, so default, pending, confirmed, and remove unselected. But these are kind of still new. We haven't had too much of a chance to play with it, and Google just doesn't have documentation on these yet. But I think they're really evolving kind of how you interact with it and making it more complex and more natural for the ways that you'd normally see on a website where retweet might be toggled as retweeted after you retweeted a tweet. Timeline items can also have attachments. So these are videos, images. So an example is you might have an app that shares an image with somebody else. In that case, that timeline card would just have an attachment, which is an image or a video. The other base object in Google Glass is location. So these are pretty typical. They give you the latitude, longitude, and accuracy, plus the address and display name if possible. And these are kind of interesting because you can not only get the location of a user if they choose to share it with you, but you can subscribe to Google, and Google will actually ping you when a user moves at some frequency. And you can also check where things like timeline items were created, so you can see where, let's say, a photo was taken, and perhaps kind of react accordingly on your backend. So the way to kind of listen, now, because you have all these actions, you need to subscribe to Google by giving them a URL, and Google will just ping your URL when a user does something to a card. So these are called subscriptions in Google's mirror parlance, and they're really just callback hooks. So what you provide to Google is just, I want to create a subscription for a user, so an authored-in user. So I create a subscription, you pass in a user token, which is just anything you want, presumably like the database ID for that user. Some verification token to verify that this was from Google. And Google, every time then a user kind of interacts with one of your cards, Google will just ping your server saying, user X did actions, ABC to this specific card, and your server can react accordingly. What's interesting is that they kind of batch these all together a lot of times because the mirror, or glass rather, can be used without internet access. So you get an array of actions that the user has done since they last synced up with the glass. From a development perspective, this is kind of interesting because, one, you have to create a new subscription per user. It's not something you set per the application. So it's per user. So this user, I want to create a new subscription for them that points to this URL with these fields, and then Google will send those back, rather than, for this application, all updates from all users should go to this URL. And also the callback URL is HTTPS only, but Google's added some tools to allow you to kind of deal with it better in development mode. So the API for all of these things is pretty simple. It's just a simple REST API with the standard delete, get, insert, list, patch, and update. Patch and update are kind of interesting from an API standpoint because I haven't seen that too much in many APIs recently. And patch is just kind of updating a subset of fields versus update replaces that object with a new object that you specify. One of the really annoying parts right now is that you can't use the Mirror API unless you're a Google Glass owner. So what Google has done is they've kind of whitelisted all of the owners of Google Glass. They've kind of whitelisted all of their email addresses. So only those people can access that API in the Google API console. So the workaround for now is if you don't have a pair of Google Glass, you have to get someone who has Google Glass to create a new Google project and then have them invite you on it. And from there, then you can access the Mirror API, which is kind of really annoying, and I hope that Google opens it up so that anyone can use it or at least test it even if they don't have Glass. So as I kind of alluded to before, the typical workflow for a Google Glass app then, kind of different from a regular app, is that the first step is just authorization. So you'll OAuth with Google, you'll ask for some particular scopes, and it'll just kind of work. You'll get this access token and a refresh token. And if you have cards that have callbacks, you'll presumably want to insert a subscription right there as soon as the user auths in with the app. And if you want to send a welcome card or a pinnable card with some action that your app does, right after they authorize would be the perfect time to do it because then they'd get it immediately if they're wearing Glass. So then kind of from there, it's just kind of offline. You decide, oh, I want to send a notification to this user. So you have to verify their access token. If it's expired or if it's not working, you can request a new one from Google with a refresh token. And then from there, you can just insert a new timeline card, update one, rebundle cards, kind of whatever that action you want to do is. After you send a card, then you have to be kind of watching your URL to see if the user does something. So typically what will happen is Google sends some packet that says user X did actions Y, Z on this card. You'll take that, you'll return it 200 to Google, and then you'll just do the actions on your server, and then update or delete cards accordingly. So now I'm going to hand it off to Han, who will talk more about kind of practically developing with the Mirror API.
Thanks. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of context here. I think this is right. All right, so this is Google Glass's GitHub account. And you can see that they have several different repositories. These are quick start sort of bundles that you can use to get started accessing the Mirror API. I know this is an Android talk, which is kind of funny because no one's really specializing on Android here. But originally this talk, me and Kunal, we spoke at the San Francisco Rails meetup. And the reason for that was because, as you can see here, you have no Ruby. And so the point of it was, to sort of advocate developing for the Mirror API using Ruby. But since you guys are probably more familiar with Java being Android developers, something that you guys probably want to know about. All right, so I just kind of want to get a feel for what you guys, like your experience levels. I mean, have you guys developed web apps? I mean, is Android just a specialty, or how many people here have developed web apps? Use JSON, all that stuff? Yeah, all right, cool. Really? Well, that's great. That's great. Awesome. Then, so the argument that I made before was that, why would you want to even develop for Glass, right? I mean, no one has it. How many people here have it? 2. It's got to be like 1%, right? So, all right. I mean, that leaves pretty much 99% of us out of luck, right? So, I mean, what is the argument for developing for Glass? Well, me and Kunal just randomly decided to do it one day. And it ended up taking us about 3 days. At the time, I think they only had 2 or 3 of these. And the documentation was a lot more sparse. So the situation is such that today, with the resources that are available, it should take you guys a fraction of the time, maybe a day. Do you guys have apps that you guys are currently working on? Probably. You guys are developers, right? Yeah. So you guys have a back-end service that you guys might think about creating a new platform for, right? Well, I mean, just the fact that the Mirror API is just ridiculously easy to use should make it sort of an easy value proposition for anyone here, right? All right, so the Mirror API is just kind of a fancy name for a very limited version of a web app. I mean, what you're essentially doing is creating sort of a diminished version of a browser experience. I mean, what you're doing is you're sending in a JSON request to Google snippets of HTML. This HTML is parsed by Google and then inserted into a Google user's or Glass user's device. And you have restrictions on the amount of CSS you can use, as well as, well, you can't use JavaScript. But this kind of makes sense considering the device, right? I mean, it's not a huge screen. The interaction is rather limited. So the way I think of it is you basically have a little browser right here. The menu items, to me, I think of them as links. That's all they are. They're ways to interact with the app, right? Your server will process this response. User clicks a link, you'll send them back some sort of interaction, whatever it is that you have decided to do, right? So, I mean, it should fall within that comfort range that you guys already have, you know, developing apps or whatever, right? So that's sort of the value proposition. Yeah. Well, if you're using the Mirror API. I believe writing a native Glass app, that would be untrue.
But if I do want server interaction, it has to go through Google?
You can probably get server interaction through a native Glass app, pretty sure. I mean, you can probably just make an HTTP request, right?
And what's the big advantage to using the Mirror API versus just writing?
Simplicity. I mean, it's.
I can use JavaScript if I write a native client on Glass that doesn't go
But
through
what are you going to do with that exactly?
JavaScript. I don't know, whatever.
I mean, like, let's just think about some of the possible use cases, because I think the success of Glass, I mean, comes down to viable use cases, right? I mean, like, what are you going to do? Right? I mean, there's a little screen here. It's not a HUD. So let's dispel that myth, you know? Like, it's not overlaid on your eye. You're not seeing the identity of the person in front of you. You're not, you know, evaluating, you know, how tall they are or, you know, I mean, nothing like that, right? It's just a little screen in the corner of your eye, right? I mean, so like, I mean, the potential benefit of JavaScript, to me, I think, anyway, is very limited here because the interaction is limited.
You could do form validation? Or
I mean, form validation implies that person can actually use a form, right?
you could speak to, I don't know, I mean.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, so.
It seems like basically a encrypted system.
No. I mean, like, okay, think about if you were on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange.
All right.
You had a pair of Google Glass. You were getting real-time updates about events that were occurring across the globe. Now, everyone else is screaming, they're buying, they're selling. You're getting these little updates, and that's queuing your ability to buy or sell.
But just to be clear, my only interaction is through cards that are being pushed to me, right?
Yes, so it's like, imagine Twitter,
Yeah.
only it's right there in front of you all the time. Yes, Twitter on steroids. That's exactly what it is. That is exactly what it is. I mean, that's just how I think of it. It is an activity feed, right? It's a way to get updates. Location-based apps are going to do the exact same thing. They're going to give you updates, right? So yeah, I mean, like, you know, in one respect, you can think of Google Glass apps as being sort of a restricted, sort of diminutive version of an app. On the other hand, I think of it as personally being very liberating because this is a new experience. It's hard to imagine the different possibilities for it. And the fact that it's so confined makes it easier for me to think about things, the different combinations of things to make, right? And the different use cases that are possible from it. But that's me. So me and Kunal developed for Google Glass. It took us 3 days, but we had the intention of extracting what we had made into open source gem. That's like a Ruby library so that people can develop stuff for it easier. Now, there's a lot of resources for Glass right now. I mean, there's Google has their own sort of libraries which allow you to interact with the various libraries, APIs. But none of them are tailored specifically for the Mirror API, which is something that me and Kunal had worked on. So show you exactly how easy it would be to get going. With a Glass app. So this is Rails. If you guys if you guys are not familiar with it, it's I'm just creating a new application here. Now, you need to have, obviously, a user account. So I'm going to include a Ruby library which allows me to create that. Here I'm going to install authentication. Here's my user model. Now I'm going to install sort of the interface to the Mirror API. This will take a second. It'll generate some stuff for me. So in order to interface with the Mirror API, you need to have configuration keys, which Kunal pointed out you need to have a pair of glass for. Now there's a way to circumvent this. I mean, there are, in fact, glass meetups. So you can go to glass meetup. You can talk to somebody who has a pair of glass. If you sweet talk them, they might be willing to lend you a pair of API keys for your app if you wanted to get started right away. Would be nice, though. Probably the way to do it. So here we go. OK. So I have now created a basic Rails app, which has a user, and it has the gem installed. I have this other Rails app, which has the actual keys. So obviously, you need the pair of keys, and I didn't want to do that live. So I will just start here. I'm going into the console, and I'm going to show you exactly what it takes. So let's say this is me. This is a user. The user also has a Google account, which is generated by this gem, right? Now, what I can do is I can create a model which represents a timeline item, which is a card, which is something that you're going to be posting to a user with glass. Stock price, right? Kind of makes sense. Oops. I have to make sure that's migrated. Oops. Sorry. So here we have our glass stock price, which I just created. So now I've created a timeline item. So let's say I wanted to So when you create a glass app through the Mirror API, I mean, what you are actually doing, as you can see here, is you are inserting HTML and you're posting that to a user. Each of these templates here that we have generated for you are predefined by Google. These are the basic templates which they tell you, hey, you should adhere to these templates when you're using the Mirror API, right? Here's one with just text. Here's one that auto resizes. Here's one with an image in the background, right? And so here, image full, that's the image with the background. Image left with the section right. Image left with the table right. So these are all pre-generated for you if you guys are using Ruby. Now might be a good time to convert. So let's say I want to insert into, I don't know, the table, or here, content. Right? Some sort of notification because the stock price has gone below a threshold, right? Because that would be important to me. I want to know if I'm losing a bunch of money. Oops. Why can I not copy that? Here we go. Now, if I want to insert into the Mirror API, which uses a REST interface, so they expose get, put, update, post, right? I mean, you guys are all familiar with this stuff. Insert is essentially post. Right? As you can see, I've just posted to a theoretical timeline. Now, you can write all the logic that you want for this, but the use cases are very simple. I mean, like if you already have an app that deals with stock prices, that queries a bunch of APIs for them, then here you go, right? You can get started, 5 minutes, you're good to go. I mean, it's not going to take you very much time. That's the value proposition. Developing for the Mirror API is going to be very quick. Yeah. Yeah, I just made a post request using the gem that we created, me and Kunal. And I just inserted that for a Google user. Now, so when you create a Mirror API app, you're going to have each user authenticate through Google.
Was the playground the actual REST client, or was your Google?
Well, the playground represents the timeline. So it will basically, it's sort of like a limited version of Glass. It will show you the things that would have been posted to your Glass. So I don't have a pair of Glass. I just received my invitation this week. So, I mean, soon, hopefully, I will have a pair of Glass of my own. But currently, I do not. And so what I have to do is I have to make do with the tools that they provide me, which is the playground and API keys, which I managed to, talk someone into lending me, right? Yeah.
Do you feel like the playground is robust enough in the sandbox to do development, or?
I mean, partially. So you can't do everything that you want to do. That's an excellent question. It's very limited. I mean, like the native menu actions, like reading aloud, if you use the Mirror API in a very specific way, you can send text that can be read aloud to a user. Right? This is a native built-in capacity. You can't do that using the playground. You can see that the JSON has been sent correctly. And when me and Kunal were building our app, we intended to use this function. And I remember inferring from the fact that I saw speakable text appearing in the JSON here, in this area here, that it actually worked. Of course, Kunal was skeptical, but I was correct. So as you can see, you can inspect the results of whatever it is that you're posting to Google. And these are, just cards which have been posted by the app that me and Kunal made. And so you can see this is the timeline that a Glass user would be seeing. They would be swiping through this left and right. If they were to click on this, they would have these options here. They could email it, they could like it, they could dislike it. But even more than that, as you can see, there's a speakable text. So if they clicked the option which does not appear here because it's limited, they could have this section right here read aloud to them. And it's not bad. I actually think the reading aloud function is pretty cool. Google also has a native capacity for you to speak into it and have that transcribed into text. Obviously, this is sort of error prone because, you know, speech to text is error prone. It's kind of a cool feature to be able to take advantage of. But yeah, so while you're developing for it, if you have borrowed keys, this is going to be your primary tool. Yeah.
Is there a way, like what I'm excited about is the camera. You know, it has a camera so you can make so many cool apps. Is there a way to get data from the camera and use it?
So you want to recreate a HUD-like, you want the HUD-like capacity, but it's just, it's not really there. I mean, like, you can possibly do that natively. I think that's probably going to be your best bet, but it's probably not going to be everything that you think that it's going to be.
What version is Playground right now?
I'm not even sure if they're versioning it, to be honest.
Have you seen any, I mean, obviously the capabilities are limited, but enough to kind of get the ball rolling.
Enough to get the ball rolling.
Expansion and growth, and would you project, say, 3 months from now, that Playground would actually be a fairly feature-rich environment?
I mean, I don't know what they're doing behind closed doors, right? I mean, how much they're working on the Playground. I think they're probably focusing on Glass, right? I mean, it's very beta. If you've ever used Glass when it was first released, it was quite buggy. It was quite buggy. It's improved quite a bit now, but the original versions were, you know, you could tell that they were beta devices. So I'm sure their focus is trying to get out, you know, their first commercial release. Yeah.
I think if you create a native Android app, that's the limiting factor.
I mean, like, I encourage, like, you know, bold experimentation, whatever. But honestly, I think your best bet is going to be finding, like, the best use cases for this very experimental device. And I think the Mirror API, while limited, is somewhat freeing in that respect because you don't have to think about all of those possible things. If you can think of that use case where a person can receive a notification anytime, I'm telling you, that in and of itself, that capacity is insanely valuable. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the timing of cards, how long they stay on screen, and whether that's something that you as developers can control?
So there's a maximum number of cards, and they will expire after a set amount of time. You have a limited amount of control. You can actually delete a card. In fact, you can update a card to represent a new time. So, for example, oops. Yeah.
So, like, let's say you want to push coupons while you're walking in front of the store, and you think, okay, we're on a sale, right? So while they're in front of your store, you want to keep the card visible, kind of force that. Is that possible?
Yeah, you could, because you could update the display time. And
So the card is visible until the user dismisses it? Is that the case?
it's visible until enough cards have been created that it's pushed to the very back, or you have sent a post request updating the time, which causes it to be moved back to the front. So there has to be some control mechanisms in place, and that's actually that's a good observation because that's something that you do want to think about. I mean, I think that's a very relevant design concept, which is going to be very important in developing Glass applications. As you can see right here, I've just updated it. And it has updated it automatically to the time at which I've updated it. You can actually specify a time, which can be in the future, in fact.
You could, in theory, create like a rudimentary animation with the multiple cards, right? By specifying if you have a keyframe.
Well, the glass device doesn't actually stay on, so you're not going to, I mean, like, you're talking about creating like a movie with timeline cards. I don't think that that's actually practically feasible.
From my understanding, and whether or not it can be encoded.
I mean, you have to think of it like Twitter. I mean, if you think of it like Twitter, it's like you don't really have that control, right? And that's exactly why the Twitter analogy is so strong, I think, in my head. I mean, it's all about what is currently happening, what is currently being pushed to that user.
I got some business-related questions. First of all, like, so it's $1,500. Do you think, like, what I've read is you can make apps that can charge user? So why would somebody pay?
Well, I mean, that's
Then,
that.
like, will the price come down? And also, how can you get a Google device right now, like Google Glass?
Well,
Like people are getting now, like despite the things closed, like how does that?
well, you can sign up for it on the Glass site.
And they'll just email you?
Yeah, I mean, whenever their queue runs up to your name, I guess. So there's that. The $1,500, yeah, it's steep. They're doing R&D on their developers, which kind of sucks, but you know, what are you going to do? I mean, like, it's a very exciting thing. How many times in your life do you even get an opportunity to experiment with a new device like this? I mean, a new platform, right?
In the future, it's all going to be beautiful.
You know, Robert Scoble, I'm sure you guys have heard of him and seen the picture of him in the shower. I mean, very mellow guy. I've spoken with him. He's actually a very nice guy. You know, he thinks that the price range will probably be between $200 and $500 because of just the cost of glass. I mean, if you look at the pieces, it's not super expensive. And I think if that price range is true, I mean, I personally feel like that's going to have a lot to do with, you know, the initial traction of it, right? I mean, if it's like a few $100, I feel like people will just buy it. But, you know, that's just my opinion on the matter. I mean, I'm going to be honest with you guys. I don't know how complex it is to create an Android app, but I do know how complex it is to create an app for Google Glass using the Mirror API, and I'm telling you, cost benefit, very in the favor of actually just doing it because it's not going to take you very long, right? So, I mean, that's just sort of my pitch to you guys.
Folks, I know we've got questions, kind of organically moving to Q&A period. We've got about 5 minutes. So
Yeah, so questions, I guess?
if you want to finish up, you know, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, I'm open to questions now, I guess.
Can you define form elements in your Mirror?
Yeah, so
Pass them back to the sub.
So the form elements are represented by Mirror, or the menu items. I mean, like, I've never actually tried to implement a form element in a template.
Could you accept like text from like speech, for example? And then
They actually give you back the text from the reply action. So the reply action is a built-in action. I can't show it to you on the playground because they don't support built-in actions. But when you hit reply, you can talk to your glass. It will record it. It will translate that, you know, as best it can into, you know, written English. And it will send you the contents of not only the audio recording, but also of the translated text. And so you can do something with the translated text, I imagine, or even the recording, if you're committed to, you know, reinterpreting it or whatever.
is there a similar way of grabbing camera input, like videos or photo?
You know, like in my sort of exposure with the Mirror API, I mean, I didn't really mess around too much with that stuff. I also didn't mess around too much with the location stuff, which is actually, I think, a very interesting aspect of it. But I believe there is a way that you can take, I mean, not live camera input, but things that have already been taken pictures of and send that stuff.
We've got about time for about 2 more questions, folks.
Got a question about the Wi-Fi and how does it work on like internet? Like you just use Wi-Fi or
It tethers to your phone.
any phone?
Yeah, well, currently in Android is probably better because it can actually duplicate the screen on the Android device.
And for location, it has like a GPS chip in there?
I believe so.
Can the user scan QR code?
You know, I don't know, but you can probably just take a picture of that and then do whatever you wanted with that. So I mean, like, I imagine a QR code app would be very easy to make, actually.
Send the photo to your web service, the web service.
Exactly, exactly. So you can already think about, I mean, like, the limitations are not really limitations once you start thinking about the ways that you can process the information.
This is a user experience veneer that they put. Of course, you can do whatever process.
Yeah, exactly, exactly, exactly.
Have you talked to Google about Ruby on Rails and adding it to the package?
You know, I just think that Google sort of kind of, like, you know, they have a thing against Ruby or something. I don't know. It's all right. I mean, like, obviously I'm enthused enough about Glass so that it didn't really stop me. So, any more questions? All right. Thank you.